Under the law of Moses, why was a younger woman considered unclean about once every month? This is the question that we seek to answer today as we continue our verse-by-verse study of the book of Leviticus on Walking Through the Bible. If you have a Bible with you, turn to Leviticus chapter 15. We're going to be reading from verses 19 to 24. If you don't have a Bible, don't worry. Just follow along with us on the screen. The version that we'll be reading from is the New King James Version. So, Leviticus chapter 15, beginning at verse 19. If a woman has a discharge, and the discharge from her body is blood, she shall be set apart 7 days, and whoever touches her shall be unclean until evening. Everything that she lies on during her impurity shall be unclean. Also everything that she sits on shall be unclean. Whoever touches her bed shall wash his clothes and bathe in water, and be unclean until evening. And whoever touches anything that she sat on shall wash his clothes and bathe in water, and be unclean until evening. If anything is on her bed or anything on which she sits, when he touches it, he shall be unclean until evening. And if any lies with her at all, so that her impurity is on him, he shall be unclean 7 days, and every bed on which he lies shall be unclean. As we've said in our previous 2 episodes, chapter 15 of Leviticus deals with some issues that are touchy subjects. They were important to discuss here in Leviticus because these issues made someone physically unclean under the law of Moses. No, the person hadn't sinned, but that doesn't matter, for being unclean under the law didn't always mean that one had sinned. Why was it important? Because in order to approach God and offer sacrifices, one had to be clean. And so if God viewed someone as unclean, it would be sinful for someone to offer sacrifices to him. What we've discussed thus far is when men have discharges come from the body of which sexually transmitted diseases would be included, and when men have voluntary and involuntary discharges of semen. We noted the different processes for being cleansed from both. For the man who had the bodily discharges, once the problem seemed cured, they were to count 7 days during which they would wash themselves and their clothes. After that, they were clean and were to go and offer 2 turtle doves, one as a sin offering and the other as a burnt offering, sacrifices they couldn't offer during their uncleanness. However, when a man emitted semen, whether voluntarily or involuntarily, they were only unclean until evening and were to wash themselves and their clothing on which contained the semen. If this emission occurred during sexual intercourse, then the woman was to follow the same procedure. No sacrifice was required in this situation. Coming now to verse 19, the topic changes from men to women. Specifically in verse 19, the topic turns to a woman who has a discharge, in this case when that discharge is from her monthly menstrual cycle. As we know, beginning at the onset of puberty, as part of the normal reproductive process, female bodies will prepare itself for the possibility of pregnancy. This occurs monthly, about once every 28 days. Should the female's egg be fertilized by the male sperm following sexual intercourse, the woman will become pregnant with child. However, if the egg is not fertilized, a female will undergo a menstruation period in which the uterine lining is shed, resulting in menstrual blood being emitted. Unless modern-day steps are taken to prevent this, this monthly cycle will continue until a woman has reached menopause, which usually is in the mid to late 40s, at which point she is no longer able to give birth to children. Under the law that people are under today, the law of Christ, Christian women do not need to worry about this as it concerns their service to God, but such was not so under the law of Moses. Following the discharge of the menstrual blood, she would be unclean for 7 days. That meant that on average, a woman would be considered unclean about a quarter of the month if she was young. Anything she sat on would be unclean. Anything she laid down on would be unclean. Whoever touched her would be unclean until evening, and based on what we've read in Leviticus already, would have had to wash themselves and their clothing in order to be considered clean. Now we might think that God is being cruel here, for menstruation is simply a fact of life for women. But as we've seen, a bodily discharge, no matter how natural, for both men and women, would be considered unclean, so God is not singling out women here. Moreover, today women have multiple types of products that help them during this period of time, whereas in the time of Moses, such was not available, meaning that a woman's clothing would become dirty. So again, we see a possible secondary hygiene reason as to why God made the commands that he did, though his primary reason of uncleanness and approaching his holiness as clean under the law trumped any secondary reason he might have had. Coming back to the chapter now, verse 23 says that anything that was on her bed would be considered unclean. So if someone else touched it, or anything the woman sat on, they would be unclean until evening. and would have to purify themselves. Finally, we deal with a man that has sex with a woman during her menstrual cycle. This is going to be forbidden, as we'll see later on in Leviticus. So what is being talked about here? A man having intercourse with a woman during which her menstrual cycle begins. If this happens, and her impurity, meaning menstrual blood, was transferred to him, that man would be unclean, and all the rules that pertain to her now pertain to him. But unlike what we'll see later, neither the man or the woman is to be blamed here, because the woman was not yet unclean when they both decided to have sex. We'll conclude chapter 15, the Lord willing, in the next episode. With that, our time is up for today. The Lord willing, we hope you'll join us for tomorrow's discussion of Leviticus chapter 15, verses 25 to 33, as we continue our walk through the Bible, one verse at a time. Thank you for watching today's episode. We hope that you found it edifying and ask that you not only subscribe to our channel and podcast, but that you like and share this episode among your friends, so that the saving gospel of Jesus Christ can go out to the whole world.